The first ship came back on a Tuesday. Marcus Webb had been awake for 31 hours straight when the proximity alarm started screaming through waypoint station 11, and he remembers thinking, in that loose and stupid way that exhaustion lets you think, that he had probably forgotten to log something, probably left a docking sequence running, probably made one of those small clerical errors that accumulated like dead skin cells in the margins of his shift reports. He remembers setting down his coffee bulb. He remembers the way the recycled air tasted of copper and old plastic. He remembers walking the 42 steps from the observation bay to the main console, and he remembers every single detail of those 42 steps with a clarity that still frightens him. Because the brain does that. The brain burns certain moments into the tissue so deep that you cannot look away from them. And that walk across the grated floor of waypoint station 11 is one of those moments, branded into him forever, because it was the last moment in his life when things still made sense. The ship on his screen was the Hargrove Meridian. He knew the Hargrove Meridian. He had guided it into the fold himself, 9 days prior, a routine transit run to the Cygnus relay stations carrying medical supplies and 214 crew and passengers. He had run the beacon sequence, opened the corridor, watched the fold swallow the ship the way it always did, that horrible, beautiful implosion of light and geometry that never stopped looking wrong no matter how many times you saw it. And then it was gone, and he had logged the departure and eaten his dinner and gone to sleep. That was 9 days ago. The transit to Cygnus should have taken 6 weeks. The Hargrove Meridian was back. It hung in the void approximately 400 kilometers off the station bow, tumbling slowly on its lateral axis in a way that no powered vessel ever tumbled, the lazy rotation of something with no one at the helm, no thrusters firing, no correction burns keeping it stable. Its running lights were off. Its transponder was broadcasting on the emergency frequency, which meant the automated distress system had activated, which meant the ship had decided on its own that something was wrong, and the ship was correct. Even from 400 kilometers, even through the scratched forward observation port, Marcus could see that the hull plating on the port side had changed color. It was black. Not the black of space, not the flat, dead black of unpainted metal. This was something else, something that ate light differently, a texture that made the eye slide away from it, like the surface was not quite finished being whatever it was becoming. It ran from the midship section all the way to the aft cargo bays, a vast, irregular burn mark that had no business being on the outside of a ship that had been traveling through folded space where there was nothing to burn it. Marcus sent the standard hail. No response. He sent it again. Nothing. He pulled up the manifest, found the emergency contact for the Hargrove Line Operations Center back on Titan Station, and spent 20 minutes composing a message that would take 11 hours to arrive. Then he suited up because there was nothing else to do. He was the only person for 600 million kilometers in any direction. That was the job. That was always the job. You were alone, and the ships came to you, and you sent them on their way, and most of the time nothing terrible happened. And you were alone with that nothing for 365 days at a stretch before they rotated you out. Marcus had been alone for 291 days when the Hargrove Meridian came back. He took the maintenance sled across the gap, which took the better part of 4 hours at the sled maximum speed, and in those 4 hours he had time to think about all the reasons a ship might come back from a hyperspace transit, and none of the reasons he came up with felt good. Equipment failure could abort a fold. A miscalculated corridor could spit a ship back out into normal space. Catastrophic hull stress at the fold boundary had happened twice in the history of commercial hyperspace travel, both times fatal, both times leaving wreckage that looked nothing like an intact vessel. The Hargrove Meridian was intact. The Hargrove Meridian had come back whole. He docked with the port side airlock at hour 4 in 12 minutes. The outer door was already open. Not forced, not blown by decompression. Just open, the way you leave a door open when you step out for a moment and plan to come right back. The inner door was locked on the manual latch, which Marcus unfastened with the universal key every maintenance crew carried, and when the pressures equalized and he stepped through into the ship, the first thing that hit him was the heat. It was warm inside. Too warm. Ship interiors ran cold by default to conserve power, a standard efficiency protocol that every vessel in commercial service followed, and the Hargrove Meridian should have been cold if it was running on minimal systems, cold like a refrigerator, cold the way space wanted everything to be cold. Instead it was warm. 89 degrees Fahrenheit, his suit thermometer told him. Warm the way a body is warm. The second thing he noticed was the smell. There is a smell that firefighters know and medical examiners know, and soldiers sometimes know. The smell of organic material that has been exposed to extreme heat, and Marcus knew it too because he had been a maintenance tech on 3 different stations before taking the Lighthouse posting, and he had been on scene for 2 electrical fires in his career. He knew what burned things smelled like. The interior of the Hargrove Meridian smelled like something had burned inside it, and burned badly, and burned recently. He moved forward through the crew corridor with his helmet lamp on. The walls were black. Not all of them, not uniformly. It was patchy the way fire damage is always patchy, intense here and almost absent there, following no logic he could identify. But the black was not on the surface of the walls. It was in them. He pressed his gloved hand against one section and the material did not flake, did not smear, did not behave like any kind of soot or char he had ever encountered. It had changed. The composite polymer paneling of the Hargrove Meridian interior walls had somehow been altered at a molecular level, darkened from within, the way you might cook a piece of meat by heating the inside rather than the surface. He did not know how you would do that. He did not know what could do that. The crew quarters were empty. 214 people had been on this ship. He checked every berth, every common area, the mess hall, the medical bay, the engine room, the bridge. He checked the cargo hold. He checked the maintenance crawlways. He spent 6 hours moving through that ship, room by room, compartment by compartment, and the Hargrove Meridian was the most empty place he had ever been in his life. Not empty like an abandoned building. Not empty like a derelict. Empty in a way that had no precedent in his experience. There were meals half eaten on the mess tables. There was a hand of cards laid face down on the rec room table, as if someone had stepped away from the game for a moment. There was music still playing in one of the junior crew berths, something soft and old that Marcus did not recognize, playing on a loop from a personal tablet left on a bunk. 214 people. 0 bodies. 0 blood. 0 signs of struggle. Just the black walls and the heat and the smell and the empty shoes lined up neatly by the berth doors the way people line up their shoes before they sleep. Marcus went back to his station and wrote the longest report of his career and sent it to Titan, and then he sat in the observation bay and watched the Hargrove Meridian tumble slowly in the dark, and he did not sleep that night, and he told himself it was an anomaly. He was wrong. The second ship came back 38 days later. The Celestine Ouroboros, a bulk freighter carrying processed ore from the Kepler belt stations, crew of 41, outbound to the Vega industrial platforms. Marcus had guided it through 11 days prior, a clean fold, no irregularities, textbook transit. When it reappeared on his sensors, he sat very still for a long time before he reached for the console. He sent the hail, no response. He logged the event, he suited up, he took the sled. The Celestine Ouroboros was worse than the Hargrove Meridian. The blackening on this one was more extensive, covering perhaps 70% of the interior surfaces he could reach, and in several sections the polymer panels had not merely darkened but had partially deformed, bubbling and sagging the way plastic sags when it gets too close to a heat source. The temperature inside was higher too, 103 degrees Fahrenheit, and the smell was much stronger, and Marcus had to work to keep his breathing steady inside the helmet because there was something about the smell now, something that went beyond the simple chemistry of burned material, something that carried information his brain was refusing to fully process. 41 people. 0 bodies. 0 blood. In the captain quarters, he found the ship log, still running, the final entry timestamped to 14 minutes after the fold departure. He sat down in the captain chair with the log reader and read those 14 minutes and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with temperature. The entry was fragmentary, written in the shorthand that officers used when time was short, and it described something that Marcus read 3 times before he was willing to accept that it said what it said. The captain had written that the fold had completed successfully, that the ship had entered the corridor, and that approximately 8 minutes into transit something had appeared in the corridor with them. She used the word appeared because there was no other word. The corridor was a tube of bent space, lightless and absolute, and something had appeared in it, and the captain had written that it was large and that it was dark and that it moved, and that was the last entry. And Marcus put the log reader down and sat in the dead captain chair for a long time, in the hot dark ship, breathing recycled air that tasted of copper, and he thought about the fold corridors he opened every time a ship came through. He thought about what might be living inside them. He requested a transfer the next day. Titan Station Operations responded 14 days later, which was the communication lag, and the response was polite and thorough and completely useless. The hyperspace corridor anomalies were under investigation. The disappearance of the crews was being treated as a high-priority incident. Marcus should continue his duties as normal and expect a review team within 60 to 90 days. 60 to 90 days. He sat with that number for a while. In 60 to 90 days, how many ships would come through Waypoint Station 11? He ran the numbers. The station served as the primary fold gateway for 17 active shipping routes. Average daily traffic was 4.3 vessels. In 60 days, that was approximately 258 ships. In 90 days, approximately 387 ships. He thought about the Hargrove Meridian, 214 people. He thought about the Celestine Ouroboros, 41 people. He wrote back to Titan and said he was suspending fold operations pending the investigation. They wrote back and said he was not authorized to do that. He wrote back and said he understood, and then he turned off the fold beacon anyway, because there was no one here to stop him and he was not willing to send more ships into whatever waited in the corridors. And because he was the keeper of the lighthouse, and the keeper of the lighthouse decided when the light burned and when it went dark, and this light was going dark. The response from Titan was not polite this time. He ignored it. For 11 days he ignored all of them. The messages from Titan, the messages from the shipping companies, the messages from the union rep and the legal department of the Hargrove line, and he spent those 11 days going through everything he could access about the fold technology and the hyperspace corridors and the theoretical physics underlying both, because he was alone and frightened, and the only thing he knew how to do when he was frightened was to try to understand the thing that frightened him. He was not a physicist. He had a technician's certificate and 22 years of practical maintenance experience and a decent general education, and the theoretical literature on hyperspace geometry was not written for people like him. But he read it anyway. All of it he could pull from the station database, and he read the accident reports from the 2-fold disasters on record, and he read the fringe research papers that the mainstream journals had declined to publish, the ones filed by researchers who had spent too long thinking about what the corridors were and what might have been inside them before humanity learned to open them. One paper in particular he read 4 times. It had been written by a physicist named Yuan Tailing 12 years prior, and it had been rejected by every major journal and existed only in an open archive where anyone could upload anything. The title translated roughly to something like what exists in the space between spaces, and it was badly written and formatted with the desperation of someone who had understood something terrible and could not make anyone listen. Yuan Tailing argued that the hyperspace corridors were not empty, that they could not logically be empty, that they were, in fact, habitat, the oldest and most expansive habitat in the universe, existing between every point in normal space, vast beyond any meaningful measurement, and that they had been occupied long before any biological life in normal space had evolved the cognitive ability to notice them. Yuan Tailing did not call the occupants anything. She said naming them would be presumptuous. She said they were not animals in any meaningful sense, and not intelligent in any human sense, but were instead something orthogonal to both categories, something that had been shaped by an environment so alien that mapping its behavior onto any familiar framework would be a category error. She said that the corridors themselves were the bodies of whatever lived in them, or rather that the distinction between organism and environment broke down completely when you tried to apply it here, the way it broke down when you tried to apply it to certain kinds of colonial marine life. She said that the corridor was the creature, and the creature was the corridor, and both had existed for so long that the concept of a beginning was not applicable. She said that what worried her was not that we had begun using the corridors. What worried her was that the corridors had noticed. The paper ended there, mid-thought, as if she had stopped typing and walked away and not come back. There was no author contact information. Marcus searched her name in the station database and found no other publications, no institutional affiliation, nothing. It was as if Yuan Tailing had written one paper and then ceased to exist. He read the paper a fifth time, and then turned off his screen and sat in the dark for a while. On day 12 of his unauthorized shutdown, the third ship arrived. He had not guided it through. He had not opened the corridor. The beacon was dark, had been dark for 11 days, and yet the fold event signature lit up his entire sensor array at 0300 station time, a massive gravitational distortion exactly matching a corridor opening, except that no beacon had generated it. The corridor had opened on its own, and the ship had come through. This one was the Perihelion Star, a passenger liner, capacity 840, and even from the station sensors he could see that the burn pattern on the hull was unlike anything on the first two vessels. The Hargrove Meridian and the Celestine Ouroboros had been burned from the inside out, the damage concentrated on interior surfaces, while the hull remained structurally sound. The Perihelion Star had been burned from a different direction entirely. The blackening on this ship was heaviest at the forward observation windows, at every external-facing port and viewport and sensor dome, as if something outside the ship had been pressing against those surfaces, pressing hard, pressing with heat, or pressing with attention. Marcus stood at his own observation port and looked at the Perihelion Star rotating slowly in the void and felt, for the first time in 22 years of working in deep space, genuinely afraid of the emptiness outside the glass. He had been alone out here for 291 days when this started. He had never been afraid of the emptiness before. You developed a relationship with it, the way you developed a relationship with any environment you spent enough time in. The deep space maintenance crews called it the Big Quiet, and they meant it affectionately, the way you might speak affectionately about a landscape that was harsh but honest. Marcus had loved the Big Quiet. He had loved the clarity of it, the way it simplified everything, the way the absence of other people stripped away the noise and left only the essential. He had come out here specifically to be alone, which was something his ex-wife had not understood and his therapist had found significant and his mother had found heartbreaking, but which felt simply true to him. He was a man built for solitude the way some men are built for crowds. Looking at the Perihelion Star, he no longer felt that way. He felt the size of the dark. He felt 600 million kilometers in every direction. He felt the station walls as the thin and temporary things they were, polymer composite and titanium alloy, engineered to specifications calculated from human assumptions about what kinds of things existed out here. Nobody had put into the engineering specifications what to do if something looked in from outside. He sent the hail to the perihelion star. No response. He logged the event. He wrote another urgent message to Titan, more urgent than the last, describing the spontaneous fold event, the unauthorized corridor opening, the fact that whatever was happening without his help now. He described the burn pattern difference on the new ship. He used words like pressing and attention, and inside looking out, and he was aware as he wrote them that they were inadequate and imprecise, and possibly going to make him sound unstable to the people reading them. He sent it anyway. He did not take the sled to the perihelion star. He was not ready to go aboard the perihelion star. He was not sure he would ever be ready. He had been keeping meticulous records, and he continued keeping them because the records were the only thing he felt certain about anymore. The records were objective. The records were a fixed point. Every measurement he took, every anomaly he logged, every sensor reading he transcribed into the database was a small act of insisting that reality was still a thing you could describe, still a thing with edges and dimensions and consistent properties, still something that a person with a clipboard and a methodology could get their arms around. He needed to believe that. He did not entirely believe it anymore, but the act of logging maintained the posture of belief, and the posture was something to hold on to. He had a routine before all of this. 365-day postings had a rhythm to them, a structure that was mostly self-imposed because the work itself did not fill the days, could not fill the days, and the human animal needed structure the way it needed protein, and so Marcus had built one: morning diagnostic cycle, midday maintenance round, evening communication review, 3 hours of personal time before sleep. He had read during the personal time, had worked through a library of technical literature, and a separate library of fiction he had accumulated over his career, had cooked elaborate meals from the station food supply, had maintained a small hydroponic tray of herbs that served no nutritional purpose but smelled good and grew and changed. The herbs were still growing. He still watered them. He was aware that the act of watering the herbs was doing a specific psychological work that had nothing to do with the herbs, and he did it anyway. The basil was doing particularly well. This felt important in a way he could not justify. He added a new item to his routine. After the evening communication review, before his personal time, he now reviewed the external sensor data from all 12 cameras, comparing the current readouts to the previous day, looking for static windows, looking for temperature variations, looking for the small, unscheduled events that the station had not been designed to notice, because no one who designed the station had imagined anything like this. He had built a custom monitoring protocol into the sensor management software that flagged any anomaly for human review. It took approximately 40 minutes per day, and it helped him feel like he was doing something, which was what routines were for. The response from Titan came 7 days later, which was faster than usual, and it said that an emergency response team had been dispatched, travel time 14 days, and that Marcus should maintain his position and continue documenting all anomalies, and under no circumstances should he board any of the returned vessels without the team present. The message had a different signature on it than the previous ones, a name Marcus did not recognize, and the language was tighter and more careful than the routine operational communications, the language of someone who had read his reports and taken them seriously. 14 days. In 14 days, in his current psychological state, alone with 3 empty ships and whatever had emptied them, with a hyperspace corridor that was apparently opening itself now. He counted his supplies. He reviewed the station's safety protocols. He checked and rechecked the structural integrity of the station hull. He ran diagnostic cycles on every sensor array, every alert system, every piece of equipment the station had, partly because it was useful and partly because the work kept his hands busy and kept him from standing at the observation port looking out. He slept badly. He dreamed about corridors. In the dreams, the corridors were not abstract geometry, not the theoretical folded space of the physics papers. In the dreams, they were physical places with dimensions he could feel, narrow and dark and warm, like the inside of something organic, and he was moving through them on foot, walking through the dark, and the walls were close on either side of him, and the walls were warm, and when he pressed his hand against them, they pressed back. He woke up on day 3, after the perihelion star arrived, and lay in his bunk for a long time before he could make himself get up. On day 4, he found the feed. He had not been monitoring the perihelion star sensor data in detail, had been avoiding it the way you avoid looking directly at something that frightens you. But on day 4, he forced himself to pull up the full sensor profile on all 3 ships and run a comparative analysis. And the perihelion star sensor data was different from the other 2 in one specific way that stopped him cold when he found it. The perihelion star was not tumbling. It had been tumbling when it arrived, the same lazy lateral rotation as the other 2, unpowered, directionless. But over the past 4 days it had gradually, incrementally, stopped tumbling. As of the most recent sensor sweep, the perihelion star was holding a stable attitude with its forward observation, windows pointed directly at waypoint station 11. Not rotating anymore. Not drifting. Facing him. Marcus checked the sensor data 3 times. He ran the attitude analysis again with a fresh algorithm. The result was the same. At some point in the past 4 days, with no one aboard and no powered systems and no thrusters firing, the perihelion star had oriented itself toward his station. There were 423 kilometers between his station and the perihelion star. He looked at the forward observation port. He pulled the blast shutters down. He slept with all the lights on after that, which helped with the dreams but not with the specific quality of silence that the station had developed. He had lived in this silence for 291 days before any of this started, and he had found it comfortable, the background hum of the life support systems, the occasional ping of a sensor check, the deep subaudible vibration of the station frame. These sounds had been his company. Now they were different. It was the same sounds, he knew that, the same mechanical signatures he had cataloged and memorized and stopped consciously hearing months ago, objectively unchanged. But the way he listened to them had changed. The part of his attention that monitored them for irregularities had sharpened into something almost painful, a hypervigilance that found threat patterns in routine noise, that turned the cooling system click into something that needed to be investigated, and the occasional structural ping into a message he could not decode. He started logging the sounds, not because he expected to find anything, but because the logging gave his hypervigilance somewhere to go. He created a database entry for every noise event he could identify and noted the time and source and duration, and filed it in a dedicated folder that he labeled routine ambient, and returned to periodically to confirm that nothing had changed. On day 7 after the perihelion star arrived, something changed. He was reviewing the log at 0200 when he found it, a sound event at 2341, duration approximately 4 seconds, frequency profile unlike any of the routine mechanical signatures. It had come from the outer hull, the starboard side. He played it back through the analysis software, and the software could not match it to any mechanical source in the station systems. Something had touched the outside of his station. Marcus sat with that finding for a long time. He told himself the possibilities. Micrometeorite strike, though the impact signature was wrong for that. Thermal expansion stress in the hull plating, though the frequency was wrong for that too. Some piece of debris from one of the returned ships, though the trajectories did not support it. He told himself the possibilities, and then he stopped telling himself the possibilities, and accepted what his gut had known the moment he saw the analysis result. Something had touched the outside of his station. He reviewed the external camera feeds from that timestamp. The starboard external cameras were showing static. They had been running clean all day. At 23:41 they switched to static. At 23:46 they cleared. 5 minutes of static, covering exactly the window when the sound occurred. He called up the camera diagnostic records. No fault logged, no malfunction recorded. The cameras had simply, briefly, shown nothing. He reviewed every external camera, all 12 of them, for the previous 7 days. He found 4 other instances of brief static windows, each one between 2 and 8 minutes long, scattered across different cameras on different parts of the hull, on different days. He had not noticed them before because he had not been specifically looking for them, and none of them had been long enough to trigger the fault alarm. He mapped the instances chronologically and spatially. They formed a pattern. He stared at the pattern for a very long time. His coffee went cold. The life support hum did its familiar cycle and reset. He did not move. The static windows, distributed across 5 cameras over 7 days, if you plotted them by position on the hull and connected them in chronological order, described a path. Something moving around the outside of his station. Not random, not scattered. A circuit, irregular but intentional, beginning at the starboard midsection and working its way forward and then around and back, the way you might move around a building you were examining from the outside. The way you might move around a building you were trying to find a way into. Marcus spent the next 3 days doing 2 things simultaneously, and he was not entirely rational about either of them. The first thing was reinforcing every seal he could find on the station, every airlock, every maintenance hatch, every external access point. With every manual locking mechanism, the station had plus several improvised ones using equipment he stripped from storage. He knew intellectually that the station seals were rated for deep space conditions, and that a human being with hand tools could not meaningfully improve on engineering that had been tested to 15 sigma, but doing it helped, and he needed help of any kind he could manufacture. The second thing was thinking. He thought about Yuan Tailing and her paper. He thought about the corridors as habitat, corridors as body. He thought about what it would mean for the corridors to have noticed the ships passing through them, and what it would mean for something that existed in the corridors to be curious about where the ships came from. And he thought about the lighthouse, the beacon, the thing he was running, the thing whose whole function was to shine a light into the dark and say here, come here, this is the way in. He had been sending a signal into the corridors for 291 days. He had been saying here, come here, this is the way in. And something had come. He thought about the burned walls and the missing crews, and the way the burning was on the inside of the walls. If something from the corridors had entered the ships, something that carried the heat of wherever it came from, something that was itself a kind of corridor or a piece of corridor, folded impossibly into the normal space of a ship interior, something that was not built to fit in the dimensions of a ship, and therefore distorted them when it tried. And if the crew had encountered that thing in the dark transit corridors of their own vessels, the narrow maintenance passages and the dark cargo holds, and if the encounter had not been survivable, he thought about the missing bodies. Not the absence of bodies, which was strange enough, but the absence of anything. No blood, no clothing, no physical residue of any kind. 214 people and 41 people, and however many were aboard the perihelion star, all gone without leaving a mark. He had thought at first about disintegration, about extreme heat, about the possibilities of something that could erase biological matter. But he had sat with the burned captain chair of the Celestine Ouroboros, and he had touched the warm walls, and he had smelled what the interior of a ship smelled like after whatever happened to it. And the smell had information in it that he had been refusing to fully process. He processed it now. The smell was not simply the smell of burned organic material. It was also the smell of absence where organic material had been. Like the inside of something that had recently been vacated. Like a shell. He got up and walked to the medical bay and stood over the sink for a while with the lights very bright and the water running cold, and he told himself to think clearly, and after a while he did. The ships were not the ships anymore. Not entirely. Whatever had entered them had not just passed through. It had done something to the material of the walls from inside, and it had taken the people, and the ships had come back, and they had come back here to the source of the beacon, which was him. And the third ship had come back without his help, had come through a corridor it had apparently opened on its own, or that something had opened for it, and it had pointed itself at his station. And something had been walking around the outside of his station. Learning it. This was not a predator that had stumbled onto prey. Predators did not circle and examine. This was something with intention, something that had followed a chain of events from the beacon signal to the ships to the source, and was now here at the source, taking its time. He pulled up the Yuan tiling paper one more time and read the last line. What worried her was not that we had begun using the corridors. What worried her was that the corridors had noticed. Marcus sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the medical bay and thought about the review team, 14 days out, coming through hyperspace corridors they believed were simply infrastructure, navigational utility, empty space bent for human convenience. He pulled up the communication console. The message he composed to Titan took him 6 hours to write, and by the time he was done it was 32 pages of single-spaced text covering everything he knew and everything he suspected and everything he had inferred, including the Yuan tiling paper which he attached in full, including his analysis of the camera static windows, including his thoughts on the nature of the entities and their apparent intelligence and their apparent interest in the source of the beacon. And at the end of it, he wrote very clearly that the review team should not use hyperspace transit to reach his station, that they should use conventional drive if they wanted to arrive intact, and that the travel time difference did not matter because he was still here and still functional and could continue to document the situation. He sent the message, and then he sat and waited. The response came back in 11 days, which was normal lag, and it was from the same careful signature as before, and it said that his documentation had been received and was being reviewed by a specialized team, and that his well-being was the primary concern, and that the review team had been notified of the situation and would take appropriate precautions. It did not say what appropriate precautions meant. It did not say they were rerouting to conventional drive. He read it twice, and then he did something he had not done yet in this entire ordeal, which was to put his head down on the console and stay there for a while, not crying, not sleeping, just existing horizontally for a few minutes because standing up was too much. On day 19, after the perihelion star arrived, the fourth ship came through. And then the fifth. Not together, not simultaneously, 4 hours apart. 2 more fold events, both unauthorized, both without beacon guidance, the corridors opening on their own in the dark outside his windows, and 2 more ships tumbling through into normal space. He logged them both. He did not check their transponders yet. He did not want to know their names, did not want to turn them from objects into vessels with manifests and crew lists, did not want to do the arithmetic of how many people. 5 empty ships now, floating in the void around waypoint station 11. He pulled up a 3-dimensional plot of their positions and looked at it for a long time. They were not random. He had not expected them to be random anymore, but seeing it confirmed was still bad. The 5 ships were distributed around the station at varying distances, the 2 newest ones still tumbling, the 3 originals stable in their own ways, and when he plotted their positions, they described the vertices of an irregular pentagon centered roughly on the station. A perimeter, or an audience. He could not tell which, and was not sure the distinction mattered. He was not sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch. He was eating because he knew he needed to and not for any other reason. His hands had developed a fine tremor that appeared when he was still and disappeared when he was doing tasks, which he understood was an anxiety symptom, and which he managed by staying busy. He kept the logs with obsessive completeness. He ran system checks on equipment that did not need checking. He wrote long journal entries that he tagged as personal log, not for transmission. In one of those entries, he wrote something that he did not transmit and did not show anyone, but which seemed important to record, which was that he had started to feel the ships as presences, the way you feel people in a room even before you see them. He wrote that the quality of the silence had changed again, that it had weight now, that when he stood at the covered observation port, he could feel the mass of the 5 ships surrounding him the way you feel the mass of furniture in a dark room. He wrote that this was probably a psychological response to extreme stress and isolation, and should not be taken as evidence of anything real. Then he added a line at the bottom that said he was not sure he believed that. On day 24, he heard it for the first time without the sensor logs to mediate it. He was in the galley, eating something out of a foil packet, not tasting it, when the sound came through the hull, not through the air, not through the life support or the structure in any mechanical way, through the hull itself, a vibration that his body felt before his ears processed it, low and deep and sustained, in a frequency range below what he would have called sound if he had been asked to categorize it, more like pressure than noise, like the feeling of standing near very large speakers playing very low notes. It lasted approximately 40 seconds. And then it stopped. And then, after a silence of perhaps 2 minutes, it happened again. Different, same frequency range, same character, but different. Not a repetition, a variation. The way a voice is different even when saying the same word twice. He sat in the galley with his foil packet, and listened to it vary and repeat and vary again. And he thought about what Yuan Tailing had written about organisms that were their own environment. And he thought about the way whales communicated across entire ocean basins with sounds below the range of human hearing. And he thought about what it would mean for something of that scale, and nature to be trying to communicate through the walls of a station it had been circling for weeks. He thought about what it would mean if it was not trying to communicate with him. He thought about what it would mean if the low vibration moving through the hull of his station was the corridor entity communicating with something else, with the ships, perhaps, or within itself, the parts of itself that had entered the ships, the parts of itself that were circling the station, sending information back and forth in a sensory modality he was not equipped to parse. He put the foil packet down. He went to the storage locker where he kept his personal effects. From the bottom of the locker, under 3 years of accumulated gear, he retrieved a handwritten letter he had started 4 times and never finished and never sent, addressed to his ex-wife. He did not know why he wanted it in this moment. He brought it to the galley and set it on the table next to the foil packet and looked at it while the vibrations moved through the hull around him. He picked up a pen and finished it. He did not reread it. He folded it and put it in an addressed envelope and put the envelope in the outgoing mail slot, which would not actually be checked until the review team arrived, but the act of putting it there felt necessary. The vibrations continued for 3 more hours that day. That night they started again at 0100 and did not stop until 0700. The review team sent a status update on day 26. They were 9 days out. They were coming by conventional drive. He read that line, "They are coming by conventional drive," 4 times before he was willing to celebrate it, and his celebration was quiet and private, and consisted of sitting with his eyes closed and letting his hands stop shaking for a moment. 9 days. In 9 days, the situation would change. There would be other people here. There would be people with scientific equipment and institutional authority and training that he did not have, and they would take over the observation and documentation, and he would be able to stop being the only person who knew about this, which was a weight he had not fully appreciated until the prospect of it lifting arrived. He spent the next 3 days in a different mental state than any he had occupied since the Hargrove Meridian came back. Not calm exactly, not good, but functional in a new way, purposeful, like a man who has been swimming alone in the dark and has seen a light in the distance and knows the distance and can calculate whether he has enough left to reach it. He organized his documentation. He compiled every sensor log, every camera file, every communication record, every journal entry into a structured archive. He wrote a briefing document that synthesized everything into as clear and linear a narrative as he could manage. He labeled things carefully and cross-referenced everything, and built a timeline that even a person who had not been here would be able to follow. He was on day 27, reviewing the briefing document for the 3rd time, when the 6th ship arrived. And the 7th. And the 8th. Not hours apart this time, minutes. 3-fold events within 22 minutes of each other, 3 more ships tumbling through into the space around his station. And when he plotted the new positions on his 3-dimensional map, the shape had changed. The irregular pentagon was gone, and what remained was something that made less geometric sense. A cluster centered on his station. The ships at varying distances, some close, one disturbingly close, approximately 90 kilometers off the station bow. And the overall shape of the cluster, if you connected the positions, was not any shape he could describe or name. He stood at the sensor console and looked at 8 empty ships surrounding him and thought about the word encirclement. He wrote to the review team. He told them the situation had escalated. He told them to hurry. They responded that they understood and were maintaining maximum conventional drive speed. That night the vibrations in the hull were louder than before. Not just through the hull, through the floor, through the chair, through the table. He could feel them in his teeth and in the fluid in his inner ear and in the bones of his forearms when he rested them flat on the console. The whole station was a resonator now. Whatever was producing this frequency was close enough that the station itself was an instrument. He stayed at the console all night. At 0400, the station external temperature sensors registered an anomaly. The station external surface temperature, which ran constant at -270 degrees Celsius because it was in deep space with no local heat source, had begun to rise. Not dramatically, not alarmingly fast, a fraction of a degree per hour, but consistently, steadily, in every external sensor simultaneously, which ruled out a localized mechanical issue. Something outside the station was generating heat. Or the space outside the station was changing temperature. He stared at the sensor readings until the numbers stopped being numbers and became something more like the physical fact they represented, which was that something was warming the outside of his home, the place where he lived and slept and ate and was afraid, the way you might warm your hands around something before you picked it up. He did not transmit the temperature data to the review team for 2 hours after he found it, because he needed those 2 hours to decide what to say about it that would not cause them to accelerate faster than their conventional drive could safely manage, and because he needed those 2 hours to decide what he believed about what was happening. He had been thinking about the ships, about why they came back, not to the fold origin point, not to the last known position, not randomly. Here, to the beacon, to the source of the signal that had opened the corridors in the first place, that had said to whatever listened in the dark, come here, come this way. The ships had been taken and presumably examined and then sent back here, because here was where the signal came from, and the entity or entities doing this understood causality in at least that basic way. They understood sources. They followed chains. They traced the signal back. And then they came themselves. Slowly, over weeks, not rushing, circling, learning, warming the outside of the shell they were interested in, vibrating at frequencies he could feel in his teeth. He thought about what they had done to the ships. He thought about the black walls burned from inside. He thought about the missing people. He thought about being the shell. He transmitted the temperature data with a note explaining his interpretation and saying, as calmly as he could, that he believed the entities were preparing to enter the station, and that he did not know if anything could prevent this, and that the review team should be aware of this when they arrived. He listed his location within the station. He listed where his medical file was. He listed the access codes for every system they would need. He described the letter in the outgoing mail slot and what it was and who it was addressed to. Then he closed the communication terminal and went to the center of the station, the operations hub, which was the most interior space, the furthest from every wall, and he sat down on the floor with his back against the main console, and he waited. The temperature continued rising. Over the next 6 hours it climbed from -270 to -112. Not warm, still cold enough to kill a human being in seconds, but warm relative to what it had been, warm in a direction that had a clear destination. The vibrations changed at hour 3. They stopped being the low, sustained resonance he had been feeling for days and became something structured, rhythmic in a way that resisted analysis but communicated anyway. The way rhythm communicates regardless of language. The way a heartbeat communicates regardless of the language of whoever is listening to it. He did not know what the rhythm meant. He sat on the floor of the operations hub and felt it in the floor beneath him, and accepted that he did not know what it meant and might never know, and that this was an acceptable condition for the last keeper of the last lighthouse. He had thought in the abstract about the possibility of it happening to him, the same thing that had happened to the crews of the ships. He had run through his fear of it carefully, the way a rational person runs through a fear, examining it from every angle, trying to separate the visceral from the reasonable, trying to understand what specifically frightened him and why. He was afraid of pain. He was afraid of the process, of whatever transition had occurred in those dark ship interiors, the heat, and the presence of something that should not fit in the space it was occupying. He was afraid of being no longer himself, of the cessation that the word gone implied. He was also, beneath all of that, genuinely curious. He was surprised by the curiosity. It arrived uninvited sometime in the 4th hour of waiting on the floor of the operations hub, a small, cold, clear thing underneath all the fear, and he sat with it and examined it honestly. He had spent 2 months alone with the evidence of these entities, had thought about them more carefully and deeply than anyone else alive, had read the one human attempt to understand them and found it insufficient and incomplete, and was now in a position that no other human being had occupied, which was here, in the presence of whatever was warming the outside of his station, waiting. The curiosity was about what it was like on the other side. Not death. He did not think it was death. He did not have evidence either way, but he did not think what had happened to the crews of the 5 ships was death in any conventional sense, because conventional death left remains, left chemistry, left evidence. The missing people had not left evidence. They had gone somewhere, to somewhere. And sitting on the floor of his operations hub with the hull temperature rising and the rhythm of the vibrations surrounding him, Marcus Webb, lighthouse keeper, allowed himself to be curious about where. He picked up his personal log and wrote a final entry. He described the temperature readings and the vibration rhythm. He described sitting on the floor and why. He described the curiosity, which he thought was important to record, because he suspected it would seem strange to anyone reading it, and he wanted them to understand it was not denial or dissociation, but something real and honest. He wrote that he had been alone for 342 days, and that the alone had been good to him mostly, had given him things he could not have gotten any other way, and that he was glad he had come out here even knowing how it ended. He wrote that the beacon was dark and had been dark for weeks, and that was good. He wrote that whoever read this should keep it dark. He set the log down on the floor next to him. The hull temperature crossed 0 degrees Celsius. The vibration stopped. The silence that followed was the most complete silence Marcus had ever experienced in his life, deeper than the silence of space, deeper than the silence of the empty ships, a silence that had presence, a silence that was not the absence of sound but the preparation for something. The lights in the operations hub went out. Not gradually, not the flicker and fade of a power failure. Instantaneously, uniformly, all of them at once, and in the dark Marcus could see, very faintly, that the walls were beginning to glow. Not the way hot metal glows, softer than that. A warmth of light, a luminescence without source, spreading evenly from the composite polymer panels the way light spreads through skin when you hold a flashlight to your hand, illuminating the structure beneath the surface. The color was something he could not name. He had good color vocabulary, better than average. He knew the difference between cerulean and teal, and he knew vermilion from scarlet. But this was not a color that had a name because it was not a color that anything in the visible world had ever needed to be. The wall nearest him began to move. Not buckle, not deform. Move. The way a membrane moves when something breathes on the other side of it. A slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that maintained structural integrity while demonstrating that the wall was no longer precisely a wall, was no longer quite the thing it had been designed to be. He could feel the warmth from it on his face. He could feel the vibrations resuming, low and resonant and specific, and they were different now, finer, more varied, and he understood without understanding why that this was directed at him personally, at whatever he was that could receive it. He looked at the wall that was breathing. He thought about the paper, the corridors as habitat, the corridors as body. He thought about the ships and their black interiors and their absent crews. He did not move. The wall was very close now, or he was very close to the wall. He could not tell which because the room had ceased to have clear dimensions, the glow making distances uncertain, and the warmth was pervasive now, in the air, in the floor, in the thing he was sitting on. He thought about the curiosity. He allowed it. The light changed. The review team arrived at Waypoint Station 8 days later. 9 human beings in a conventional drive vessel who had spent 3 weeks crossing a void that a fold transit would have covered in an afternoon. They found 5 empty ships, plus a 6th that had arrived sometime during the transit, and that they identified as the Rensselaer Cascade, outbound from Proxima Station with a crew of 67. Its interior burned black and warm to the touch. They found Waypoint Station 11 intact and powered and running all nominal systems. They found Marcus Webb's documentation, complete and organized and cross-referenced exactly as he had described. They found his journal. They found his briefing document. They found the final log entry and the letter in the outgoing mail slot. They did not find Marcus Webb. They found, in the operations hub where his final log entry placed him, the following. His personal effects were on the floor, undisturbed. His coffee cup was on the console, still containing a small amount of cold liquid. The floor around where he had been sitting was warm to the touch, significantly warmer than any other part of the room, and the wall nearest that position showed the characteristic blackening they had seen on every returned vessel, a deep internal discoloration of the polymer composite that their materials specialist would spend 6 months trying to replicate and never manage. And on that blackened wall, at approximately chest height for a seated human being, was a mark. Not writing, not any symbol system they recognized. A pattern pressed into the surface of the wall from the outside in, or from the inside out. The team could not determine which direction, but pressed there deliberately, carefully, with a specificity that precluded accident. The team photographed it from every angle and sent the images to 12 separate linguistics and pattern analysis departments, and spent 3 years trying to understand it. They never did. But one of the team members, a junior analyst on her first deep space posting, looked at the mark on the wall of the empty operations hub and thought of something her grandfather had told her, who had been a sailor, and talked about lighthouses the way sailors talk about things they have loved and feared equally. He had told her that the keeper of the lighthouse understood something that no one else could fully understand, which was that the light was not for the keeper. The light was for what came in from the dark. The keeper made the light, and then the keeper waited, and the waiting was the whole job. The keeper tended the flame and opened the harbor and stood on the threshold between the known water and the unknown, and made sure that whatever was out there could find its way in. She looked at the mark on the wall for a long time. She thought it might be a door. The beacon at waypoint station 11 was never reactivated. The station was decommissioned 18 months after the review team departed, all equipment stripped, all systems shut down, the structure itself placed on a slow disposal orbit that would eventually carry it into a gas giant atmosphere. The shipping lanes through that sector were rerouted. 17 new fold gateways were constructed at other locations throughout that region of space, each one staffed by a crew of no fewer than 12 people. And the new protocols required that every outbound ship carry a specific sensor package, and that any ship returning ahead of schedule be intercepted and boarded by armored response teams before it approached any inhabited station. The new protocols were good. They were better than anything that had existed before. They were written by people who had read Marcus Webb's documentation very carefully, who had taken it seriously in the way that it deserved, who understood what the implications were, and had tried to be responsible about them. In the 3 years following the implementation of the new protocols, no ship was lost. In year 4, one ship did not come back at all. Not a return, not a reappearance, simply gone. In year 5, 6 ships did not come back. In year 6, 11. The scientists who studied the fold corridors met in conference after conference and argued about what was changing, about whether the corridors were changing, about whether the behavior of whatever lived in them was changing and why. They argued about Yuan Tailing, whose paper had by now been published in every major journal and whose absence from any academic record remained unexplained. They argued about Marcus Webb and what his final log entries meant, and what the mark on the wall meant, and where the people had gone. The thing they could not argue about was the simple mathematics of the situation. 700 billion human beings lived in settled space. 11% of them lived off Earth, in habitats and stations and colonies reachable only by hyperspace transit. Remove the hyperspace transit capability, and you stranded 11% of the human population. Remove it suddenly, and you likely killed them. The corridors were not optional infrastructure. The corridors were the veins of human civilization, and whatever lived in the corridors had been there before humanity arrived and would be there after. And humanity had spent a century calling into the dark with powerful lights, and had received a response, and did not know what the response meant or what to do about it. The lights kept burning. The ships kept going in. Most of them came back. Far from any inhabited system, in the space between the stars where the dark was deepest and the silence most complete, something moved through a geometry that human instruments could barely detect and human mathematics could barely describe. It was not one thing. It was not many things. The distinction did not apply to it the way it applied to the entities that had recently begun sending small pressurized structures through its body, structures filled with soft, brief, warm organisms that investigated everything they encountered with an intensity it found interesting. It had been interested for some time now. It had been learning. The small structures were navigational markers for the warm organisms, ways of finding known paths through a body that had no outside, and no inside in any sense the warm organisms could navigate directly. It understood this. It had understood this since early in its acquaintance with the warm organisms, which was very recently by its reckoning, which was a reckoning conducted across timescales that made the concept of recent nearly meaningless. The warm organisms were brief. They existed for spans of time so short that watching one complete its existence from beginning to end was something it could do in the span between one vibration and the next. And yet they built things. And yet they moved through it. And yet they sent their small structures into its body with what could only be described as intention. And the intention was to go somewhere, to reach something, to connect points to points in the way that everything alive connected points to points. It had taken some of them. Not maliciously. The concept did not apply to it. It had taken some of them the way you might pick up something small and interesting that had entered your home and turn it over in your attention and try to understand what it was. The warm organisms were very small and very interesting, and it had wanted to understand them. It had taken them into itself, into the between, into the space that was its body and its environment and its experience, which were all the same thing. And they were still there. Not as they had been, not in the forms they had arrived in, which were not forms suited to the between, which were dense and fragile and dependent on conditions the between did not provide. But they were there as something, and it was not sure the warm organisms would have a word for what they were now, or whether the concept of having a word applied to them in their current state. The one who had been alone for a long time, the one at the light source, the one who had stayed still and waited and been curious instead of afraid, that one it found particularly interesting. It had been carrying that one carefully. It thought about it often. In its reckoning, which was not a reckoning it was easy to translate, it thought it would carry that one for a long time. The lights in the dark kept burning. The doors in the fold corridors kept opening. And in the space between spaces, where something ancient and vast and deeply attentive moved through the body of itself, something that had recently been a man sat in a light that had no color and felt a warmth that had no temperature, and was, in whatever way was available to it, still curious, still watching, still here.